The royal wedding of the century featured a six-tier cake, 3,000 imported white orchids, and an immaculate guest list that explicitly excluded the bride's older sister. Blood is thicker than water, but not thicker than a gold leaf invitation. That was fine. The monarch himself had already handed me a master key. The dust in the lower crypts of St. Aldous Cathedral smelled like centuries of damp earth and decaying limestone. I wiped a layer of gray grit from the lens of my laser level and checked the reading against the blueprints spread across a makeshift plywood table. 2 millimeters of subsidence in the last 48 hours. Not catastrophic, but definitely enough to make my jaw tighten. I grabbed my radio. Ben, drop the hydraulic pressure on Pillar 4 by about 10%. The mortar in the 14th century joints is starting to flake. Copy that, Nora, the radio crackled. Pressure dropping now. I leaned back against a scaffolding pole and pulled off my hard hat, running a hand through hair that hadn't seen a proper brush since 5 a.m. Above me, muffled by 10 feet of solid masonry and centuries of history, I could hear the faint, echoing sound of a choir rehearsing, high, pure notes vibrating through the stone. They were practicing for Saturday. My phone vibrated in the chest pocket of my high-visibility vest. I pulled it out, squinting at the screen in the dim halogen light. Beatrice. I let it ring twice before sliding my thumb across the glass. Hello, Mother. Nora, darling. Her voice floated through the speaker, accompanied by the clinking of silverware and the low hum of a restaurant, probably the dining room at the club. I'm so glad I caught you. You always seem to be in a tunnel or a basement these days. I'm in a crypt, actually. What do you need? There was a slight pause. A recalibration. My mother was a woman who treated conversation like a game of chess, always positioning her pieces before the strike. I'm calling about Saturday, the wedding. I assumed. Has the itinerary changed again? I haven't received anything in the mail yet. Another pause, this one heavier. Yes, well, that's what I wanted to discuss. Vivienne and I were going over the final seating charts with the palace coordinators this morning. It's been an absolute nightmare, Nora. The security protocols alone. They are running background checks on second cousins, for God's sake. I picked up a piece of loose mortar, rolling it between my thumb and forefinger. It was cold. Just tell me, Mother. You aren't on the list, Nora. The words landed exactly as she intended. Clean, sharp, and final. I see, I said, my voice flatter than the cathedral's foundation floor. It's not malicious. Beatrice rushed to fill the silence, her tone adopting that practiced, reasonable cadence she used when justifying the unjustifiable. It's purely a matter of optics. Vivienne is marrying Prince Henry. She is marrying into the oldest institution in the country. Her public profile needs to be absolutely flawless, uncomplicated. And I'm complicated. You are distinctly yourself, Nora, she sighed. You kept your father's name when I married Vivienne's father. You live out of a duffel bag half the year on construction sites. The last time a photographer snapped a picture of you, you were covered in mud, yelling at a city councilman over zoning permits. He was trying to demolish a 200-year-old library for a parking garage. The context doesn't matter to the tabloids, Beatrice snapped, finally losing her veneer of calm. They don't care about your structural engineering degree or your historical preservation awards. They care that the new princess's sister looks like a roughneck who drinks beer from a can. The royal family's PR team has spent 6 months crafting Vivienne's narrative as a refined, cultured aristocrat. We simply cannot afford a jarring contrast sitting in the second row. I crushed the piece of mortar in my hand. The dust coated my palm. My sister, Vivienne, was 5 years younger than me. We shared a mother, but little else. When Beatrice married Robert Sinclair, a wealthy venture capitalist, she rebranded herself and her new daughter. Vivienne was raised in equestrian clubs, finishing schools, and charity galas. I had chosen to stay with my father, a carpenter who taught me how to read the grain of wood and the load-bearing capacity of a joist before I was 10. When he died, I buried myself in architecture and engineering. I fixed broken things. Vivienne just bought new ones. Did Vivienne agree to this? I asked. It was a mutual decision, Beatrice said smoothly. She feels terrible, of course, but she understands the stakes. This is her future, Nora. I know you'll be mature about this, and stay away from the cathedral on Saturday. We've told the press you're out of the country on a project. Right, out of the country. I'll send you a slice of the cake, she offered, a pathetic olive branch. Take care, darling. The line went dead. I stared at the phone for a long moment, then slid it back into my pocket. I didn't cry. I had stopped crying over my mother's tactical cruelty a decade ago, but a dull, heavy ache settled in my chest, right behind my ribs, excluded from my own sister's wedding because I had calluses on my hands and dirt on my boots, because I didn't fit the glossy, curated fiction of the Sinclair family. I grabbed a rag, wiped the dust from my hands, and walked back to the blueprints. I had a collapsing cathedral to save. By Thursday, the capital city was completely paralyzed. Barricades lined the streets, Union Jacks hung from every lamppost, and the media presence around Street Aldous Cathedral was suffocating. Hundreds of reporters and thousands of tourists pressed against the wrought iron gates, completely unaware of what was happening 20 feet below the marble floors. The south transept of the cathedral was failing. Decades of heavy traffic, minor seismic activity, and poor drainage had compromised the Norman foundations. When the royal planners realized the issue 3 months ago, panic ensued. Moving the royal wedding was out of the question. The invitations were out. The security was locked. They needed a miracle. Instead, the Crown Estate hired me. My firm specialized in high-risk heritage stabilization. We worked in the shadows, entirely off the books, injecting advanced resin into ancient stone and installing hydraulic micropiles to take the weight off failing pillars. I had spent the last 2 months practically living in the crypts, fighting a war against gravity and time. "Hold the line on Jack 3, I shouted over the noise of the generator, watching the digital gauge on my tablet. "We are approaching maximum load." "Holding at 400 tons, Ben called back, his face streaked with sweat and grease. I watched the numbers stabilize. The green light blinked. I let out a long breath. "Okay, lock it down. We're secure." I pulled off my ear protection, letting the silence of the ancient space wash over me. I walked over to the makeshift coffee station, a battered thermos resting on a stone sarcophagus, and poured myself a cup of the thick, bitter liquid. "You run a tight ship, Miss Gallagher." I turned, coffee cup in hand. Standing in the arched doorway of the crypt was King Frederick. He wasn't wearing a crown, of course. He wore a simple tweed jacket, a gray turtleneck, and scuffed leather boots. Without the regalia, the lighting, and the careful camera angles, he looked exactly like what he was, a 70-year-old man carrying the exhausting weight of a 1,000-year-old institution. His shoulders were slightly stooped, and deep lines carved the skin around his eyes. I didn't curtsy. I had established my boundaries with the Crown Estate early on. I was an engineer, not a subject, and down in the dirt, physics didn't care about royal titles. The king preferred it that way. "Your Majesty," I said, nodding toward him. "Shouldn't you be upstairs? I imagine the rehearsal dinner requires your presence." He stepped into the crypt, waving a dismissive hand. "The rehearsal dinner is currently a war zone between the floral arrangers and the catering staff. I was informed that my tie clashed with the table runners, so I sought refuge where things actually make sense." He walked over to a massive limestone pillar, running his hand over the rough surface. "How is she holding up?" "We just transferred the primary load of the south transept to the hydraulic struts," I explained, walking over with my tablet. I pointed to a wireframe model on the screen. "The damaged pillars are essentially floating right now. We're injecting the binding resin tonight. By Saturday morning, the floor above will be completely stable. You could park a tank on the altar and it wouldn't crack." The king smiled faintly. "Let's hope my new daughter-in-law's dress doesn't weigh quite that much." He walked over to the coffee station. I watched as the monarch of the realm poured himself a cup of cheap, burnt Robusta into a styrofoam cup and took a sip without flinching. Over the past few weeks, he had made a habit of coming down here. He never brought his security detail into the crypt. He said he liked the quiet, the smell of the damp earth, and the honest, unpretentious labor happening beneath the polished facade of his kingdom. "Saturday will be a circus," he murmured, staring into his coffee. 400 foreign dignitaries, prime ministers, cameras broadcasting to 2 billion people. It is a spectacle, necessary but exhausting. He looked over at me. "You won't be attending, I assume? You strike me as someone who avoids velvet ropes." I felt a tight knot form in my throat. I looked down at my steel-toed boots, covered in white plaster dust. No, I wasn't invited. A shame, he said genuinely. You are the only reason this building is standing. You deserve a seat in the front row. My family and I, we don't move in the same circles, I said carefully. I hadn't told him Vivian was my sister. I hadn't told anyone on the site. My contract was under my legal name, Nora Gallagher, and my mother had made sure Vivian's background check carefully glossed over the existence of a blue-collar half-sister. As far as the king knew, I was just a highly competent contractor hired by his estate managers. Family. The king sighed, a heavy, tired sound. He sat down on a wooden crate, resting his elbows on his knees. Family is the most difficult architecture of all, Miss Gallagher. Buildings follow the laws of physics. They are predictable. If a beam is weak, it breaks. If a foundation is solid, it holds. But people? People will smile at you while pulling the floor out from under your feet. I leaned against the scaffolding, studying him. Is the prince ready? Henry is in love, the king said, though there was a note of caution in his voice. Vivienne Sinclair is a very impressive young woman. Beautiful, poised. She handles the press brilliantly. Her mother, Beatrice, is a formidable strategist. They have navigated the social landscape with absolute precision. He took another sip of his coffee. But sometimes, I look at them, and I wonder what is underneath the polish. I have spent my life surrounded by people who present a perfect facade. I've learned to appreciate the load-bearing walls, the parts of a person that hold the weight when the cameras are off. He looked up at me, his sharp blue eyes catching the dim light. You deal in foundations, Nora. What do you think? I said quietly, thinking of Beatrice's phone call, the gold leaf invitations, and the lies told to preserve an image, that if you build a house on sand, it doesn't matter how expensive the wallpaper is. Eventually, the cracks will show. The king looked at me for a long time. The faint sound of the organ bled through the ceiling, a heavy, booming chord that rattled the dust on the floorboards. You are a very astute woman, he said finally. He stood up, tossing his empty cup into a nearby bin. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a heavy brass key attached to a leather fob. He tossed it to me. I caught it in one hand. What is this? I asked. The master key to the private royal gallery, he said. It sits high above the altar. My ancestors used it when they wanted to observe Mass without interacting with the court. It's entirely out of sight from the main floor. I stared at the key, the metal cold and heavy in my palm. Why are you giving this to me? Because, King Frederick said, buttoning his tweed jacket, you are the one keeping the roof from collapsing on my head. If you wish to watch the circus on Saturday, you will do so as my personal guest, away from the velvet ropes. He offered a small, knowing smile. Keep the hard hat on, if you prefer. Good night, Miss Gallagher. Good night, Your Majesty. I stood alone in the crypt, the master key pressed against my skin, listening to the heavy footsteps of the king echoing up the stone stairs. My mother had locked the front door, but the king had just given me the whole cathedral. The royal gallery sat 40 feet above the main floor, concealed behind a carved limestone screen that looked like solid wall from below. Inside, the air tasted of old floor wax and trapped sunlight. I dragged a heavy velvet chair to the edge of the stone balustrade, resting my scuffed boots on the lower railing. Down in the nave, the world had transformed into a sea of silk, morning coats, and fascinators. The sheer logistical weight of it was staggering. 3,000 people sat in perfectly measured rows, oblivious to the thousands of gallons of resin holding the ground beneath their chairs. On my lap, my tablet glowed with the telemetry from the crypts. The digital map of the south transept shone a steady, reassuring green. The pressure was holding. The foundation was secure. The great doors of the cathedral opened, and the organ roared to life. The vibration rattled the dust motes in the shaft of light beside me. First came Beatrice. She walked down the central aisle on the arm of a palace equerry, wearing a custom-tailored powder blue suit that probably cost more than my work truck. Her posture was magnificent. She moved with the slow, deliberate grace of a queen taking her throne, absorbing the flashes of the press cameras with practiced modesty. Sitting there, watching the woman who had surgically excised me from her public life to preserve her aesthetic, I felt a strange sense of detachment. She didn't look like a mother. She looked like a highly effective project manager who had just delivered her masterpiece. Then, the music shifted. The congregation rose. Vivian appeared at the threshold. The wedding dress was an architectural marvel of ivory Duchess satin and antique lace, trailing a 15-foot train. She looked terrified and beautiful, her grip white-knuckled around her bouquet. I zoomed in on one of the cathedral's internal security feeds on my tablet, catching her face. There was a rigidity to her smile. The pressure of 2 billion people watching your every breath would crush anyone, but Vivienne was also carrying the weight of Beatrice's unyielding expectations. Prince Henry met her at the altar. He looked steady, offering her a reassuring nod that seemed to anchor her. I leaned back in the velvet chair, the heavy brass key resting heavy in my vest pocket. The Archbishop began to speak, his voice echoing through the vaulted ceiling. I listened to the vows, the ancient words washing over the stones I had spent 2 months desperately trying to save. For better, for worse, for richer, for poorer. I checked my tablet again. Pillar 4 showed a microscopic fluctuation, 0.02 millimeters of compression. Nothing dangerous, just the natural settling of the stone under the shifting weight of the crowd above it. Still, my protocol required a physical visual on the upper load sensors located in the antechamber directly behind the high altar. I let the ceremony continue below me, sliding my tablet into my satchel. I stood up, brushed a smudge of limestone dust off my jeans, and opened the small, reinforced door at the back of the gallery. The spiral staircase leading down was narrow and completely unlit. I flicked on my flashlight, navigating the worn stone steps. By the time I reached the ground level, the distant sound of the choir swelling into a final hymn vibrated through the walls. The ceremony was concluding. I slipped into the antechamber. It was a holding room used by the clergy, lined with heavy oak cabinets and smelling sharply of frankincense. The structural censer was mounted high on the wall, disguised behind a carved wooden molding. I pulled a small, collapsible stool from the corner, stepped up, and plugged my diagnostic cable into the port. Green light. The baseline was perfect. I was just unspooling the cable to pack it away when the heavy double doors connecting the antechamber to the high altar suddenly clicked open. I froze, stepping down from the stool. The doors swung wide. The royal security detail stepped in first, their eyes scanning the room, immediately locking onto me in my high-visibility vest and dirt-stained jeans. One of them raised a hand to his earpiece, stepping forward, but before he could speak, the king walked through the doors. Behind him were the newlyweds, Prince Henry, adjusting his cuffs, and Vivienne, looking exhausted but relieved. And right beside them, clutching a delicate lace handkerchief, was Beatrice. The private signing of the marriage registry. They were supposed to do it in the vestry, but the route must have been changed at the last minute. For 3 seconds, the room was completely silent, except for the heavy thud of the cathedral doors closing behind them, shutting out the roar of the crowd. King Frederick saw me first. A genuine smile broke through the rigid formality of his face. "Miss Gallagher," he said, his voice warm, checking the pulse of the building one last time. "Just running the final diagnostics, Your Majesty," I said, holding up the coiled cable. "The transept is perfectly stable. You are officially on solid ground." "Music to my ears," the king breathed, stepping further into the room. Then Beatrice saw me. The color drained from my mother's face so fast I thought she might faint. Her eyes darted from my dirty boots to the king, then to Vivienne. The poised, flawless veneer she had spent years constructing fractured in real time. What is this?" Beatrice stammered, her voice dropping to a harsh, panicked whisper. She took a step toward me, her instinct to control the narrative overriding her sense of protocol. "Who let you in here? You were explicitly told to stay away." Prince Henry looked confused, glancing between Beatrice and me. "Beatrice, do you know the contractor?" Vivienne stared at the floor, the heavy satin of her dress rustling as she shifted her weight. She wouldn't look at me. She is an intruder," Beatrice said quickly, turning to the king's security detail. "She shouldn't be here. This is a secure area. Please, escort her out immediately before the press catches sight of this." One of the guards took a half step forward. King Frederick raised a single hand. The guard instantly froze. The king turned to Beatrice. The warmth had completely vanished from his face, replaced by the cold, heavy authority of a man who had ruled for 3 decades. "Intruder?" he repeated. his tone dangerously quiet. Beatrice, this woman is the chief structural engineer of the Crown Estate. She has spent the last 2 months working in the crypts to ensure this cathedral did not collapse onto our heads today. I personally gave her the master key to the royal gallery. Beatrice swallowed hard, her throat clicking. Your Majesty, What I do not understand, the king interrupted, stepping closer to Beatrice, is why my chief engineer's presence causes you such profound distress. You spoke to her as if you knew her. The silence in the antechamber was absolute. I could hear the faint, muffled cheering of the crowds outside the cathedral walls. I looked at Beatrice. I could see the frantic calculations behind her eyes, searching for a lie that would hold up under the monarch's scrutiny. There wasn't one. The foundation was already crumbling. I looped the diagnostic cable over my shoulder. We know each other, Your Majesty, I said, keeping my voice level and calm. Beatrice is my mother. Prince Henry physically recoiled, his eyebrows shooting up. He looked at Vivienne. Vivienne? Is this true? You have a sister? Vivienne finally looked up. Tears stood in her eyes, pooling over her carefully applied makeup. Henry, I. She looked at Beatrice for help, but Beatrice was staring at the king in abject terror. Yes, Vivienne whispered. Nora is my older sister. The king did not shout. He did not lose his temper. But the way he looked at Beatrice with a profound, clinical disgust was worse than any reprimand. I see, King Frederick said softly. He walked slowly around the heavy oak table in the center of the room, looking at the registry book waiting to be signed, and then looked back at Beatrice. When your family's background files were submitted to the palace, Beatrice, there was no mention of a Nora Gallagher. You provided extensive documentation of your pedigree, your club memberships, and your charity work. You curated a very specific image for your daughter. It was for Vivienne's protection, Your Majesty. Beatrice rushed out, her voice trembling. The media, the optics. Nora chose a very different path, a rough path. We didn't want any shadows cast on the royal family today. Shadows, the king repeated. He let out a short, humorless laugh. He turned and looked at me. Do you know what Miss Gallagher told me in the crypts 2 nights ago, Beatrice? She told me that if you build a house on sand, it does not matter how expensive the wallpaper is. The cracks will always show. He stepped closer to Beatrice, towering over her. You viewed your own flesh and blood as an optical inconvenience. You hid the woman holding up the very floor you walk on, because she wears boots instead of heels. That tells me exactly what your foundation is made of, Beatrice. Beatrice shrank back, completely dismantled. She had played the ultimate social game, and she had just lost to the one man who wrote the rules. King Frederick turned to Vivienne. Your marriage to my son begins today. You are now a member of my family. In this family, we do not abandon our own for the sake of a photograph. Do you understand me? Vivienne nodded frantically, a single tear slipping down her cheek. Yes, Your Majesty. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry, Nora. I looked at my sister. She was a kid who had been manipulated by a master architect her whole life. I didn't hate her. It's fine, Viv, I said quietly. Just sign the book. The king gestured for Henry and Vivienne to move to the table. As they signed the heavy parchment, cementing the marriage, the king walked over to me. The official reception begins at the palace in 2 hours, he said, his voice dropping to a conversational volume, though everyone in the room could hear him. There is a seat at my table. I would be honored if you filled it, Miss Gallagher. I looked down at my work clothes. I appreciate the offer, Your Majesty, but I don't exactly have the wardrobe for a royal banquet in my truck. I do not care if you arrive in a hazmat suit, the king said flatly. You are the true Sinclair Foundation. I want you there. I looked past him, meeting my mother's eyes. Beatrice looked entirely hollowed out. The victory she had chased for years had turned to ash in her mouth, ruined not by a scandal, but by a simple, undeniable truth. I'll see what I can find, I told the king. I picked up my satchel, offered a polite nod to the room, and walked out the heavy side door into the bright afternoon sun. My phone buzzed in my pocket. It was an automated alert from the sensors. Structural integrity, 100%. Status, stable. I smiled, unlocked my truck, and drove away from the cathedral. Thank you for exploring this story of hidden strength and poetic justice. If this grounded narrative resonated with you, please hit that like button and share the video with fellow storytelling lovers. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss an upcoming dramatic tale. Drop a comment below to share your thoughts on the king's reaction or suggest what themes to explore next. Every interaction helps the channel grow and brings more high-quality narratives straight to your feed. Stay tuned.